In this video, we're going to learn how to create a very tiny 1/8 inch French seam that's very strong. We use this seam in heirloom sewing for our special dresses, and you can see here that this is a very tiny finished 1/8 inch seam. In order to do this, you need to use the right fabrics. Your fabric choices for this would be something like this is a lightweight Swiss batiste, poly cotton batiste will work, handkerchief linen is a good choice, cotton lawn. This is silk dupioni. You can see the tiny seam in this one. And I've also managed to get the very tiny seam in a light heirloom weight lined piqué. It's a little trickier because this fabric is slightly heavier, but it still works. Aside from the fabric, the other supplies you're going to need is a lightweight thread. And for the thread, you would want to choose the DMC 50 weight cotton thread. Aurifil makes a 50 weight cotton thread. Metler makes a 60 weight thread. And Dual Duty also makes a 60 weight thread, and they label theirs fine on the lid. That is available in very limited colors. Then you're going to need your correct needle. Your needle can be a size 60, 65, or 70, and it can be either a Microtex or a universal needle. Either one of those work. The Microtex needle will have a sharper point to them, but like I said, both of those work. And the last thing you're going to need is a 5-groove pin tuck foot. You can see you've got the 5 grooves under here. This is an optional supply, but you're going to see when we start doing the stitching why this will be so useful to get such an accurate seam. You always want to match your thread weight, your needle weight, and your fabric weight when you're sewing any garment. To create the French seam, we're going to be working with a total 1/4 inch seam allowance. So to do that, we need to stitch 2 seams that are 1/8 of an inch. So the first thing you're going to need to do is determine on your foot where you can look to align your fabric to get an 1/8 of an inch seam. My foot on my machine has a little red mark here. That is the 1/8 inch, that's 1/8 inch from the center where the needle goes up and down. Another option on this particular foot would be to align the fabric along this metal line right here, and then bump the needle over a few clicks so that the needle is stitching at the red line. The third option for this foot would be to align the fabric to the outside edge of the foot and bump the needle all the way over to the edge here, and that would be an 1/8 inch seam allowance. So you're going to need to do that for your machine and your machine foot to determine where an exact 1/8 inch is. You can use a plain piece of paper and don't have your needle of the machine threaded, and you can align the page with one of the marks that you think might be an 1/8 of an inch and stitch a few stitches, let the needle perforate the paper, and then pull it out and check and ensure that you've got an exact 1/8 inch seam. Okay, so let's get started. For this first seam, we're going to stitch a 1/8 inch straight stitch. You want to set your stitch length to about a 2.0 and then align your fabric with wherever you have determined is the correct location to get an exact 1/8 inch seam. And go ahead and get that seam stitched. The next step is a zigzag stitch, and you're going to set that stitch with a stitch width of about 3.5 or 4 and a stitch length of 1. It's also really helpful to turn up the tension on the sewing machine a little bit because we're trying to tighten this seam up and give it a little extra strength, but also while at the same time making it narrower. This zigzag stitch, you want to have one swing of the needle to be just inside your straight stitch line, and the other stitch of the needle will come off the fabric. And it doesn't matter if it comes off a little bit or a lot, it just has to be off the fabric. And ultimately this will kind of roll up and tighten this seam. So let's get going. Okay, and you can see where that got a little bit tighter, and now it's got a lot of extra strength added to it. Once you finish this seam, you want to make sure that you press, and you need to press it well. You always are going to press the seam first flat as you stitched it, and then you want to open the seam up and press it to one side or the other. It doesn't matter which one. And then lastly, you're going to give it a press on the outside edge. That nice crisp edge will make this second stitching much easier. For this second pass of the straight stitch, you want to again set your stitch length to about a 2.0. You're going to align the seam that you just stitched inside the groove that is just to the right of the center groove. So here we've got our center groove, and here's the groove just to the right of that. Okay, you want to set that exactly inside that little groove, and then I bump my needle over a couple clicks to the right. Let's get that stitched. And here you've got it, a beautiful tiny French seam that is a finished 1/8 of an inch. I have used this same method with doll clothes, and those are typically out of heavier fabrics. I've tried this on quilting cotton weight, which is what I use a lot. This technique still works. But the seam allowance will not compact with the zigzag the way it does on a lightweight or batiste fabric. And so because of that, I don't move my needle over the 2 clicks. So you can see the difference. This is just a hair larger than 1/8, while this is the 1/8. So if that's troubling to you, you can always trim your quilting cotton seam allowance. You know, take about a couple threads off, trim that seam allowance, and you can get it down to the 1/8 as well. So have fun with your new knowledge here and go create some beautiful tiny French seams.